Welcome everyone to our 20th conference from the International Studies Department in the John Monnet Model Think in Europe. I will let our leader and moderator Inés Pousadela to introduce our panelists. This is our first session in the morning, participatory democracy at the European level. What can we, the world, learn from the EU? And then we have the second session in the afternoon with struggles for a more inclusive and participatory UN, what hopes to reform. Just a message, sorry, for our students. Aquellos que estén por créditos por conferencia deben tener su número de estudiante y nombre claro en su pantalla con la cámara prendida para que Bedelía pueda hacer el control correcto. So, Inés, the room is yours.
Thank you, Virginia, and welcome everybody to our two-part webinar on democratizing global governance, citizen power in the EU and the UN. So as Virginia has already explained, the webinar will offer space for reflection about the opportunities available for the United Nations to undergo the kind of reform that may help fulfill the potential contained in the opening words of its founding charter, which, as you know, is "We the Peoples." Only a reform of global governance towards increased inclusiveness of the world's citizens and strategic civil society participation will allow the UN to remain fit for purpose in a world that maybe partly as a result of its own successes is radically different from that of 1945. But where will this reform draw inspiration from? One possible answer, a good answer, I think, is from the European Union. So the first part of this webinar will focus on participatory and deliberative democracy at the European level. And we will ask the question, what can the world learn from the EU? Well, as we all know, the EU is the most ambitious experiment in supranational democracy so far, showing both, I think, the tremendous potential and also the big challenges of governing beyond national boundaries. As traditional notions of sovereignty evolve in an interconnected world, the EU's democratic framework offers crucial lessons for building legitimate and effective governance at the transnational level. And well, we are going to hear from different experts who will tell us a little bit about the EU's democratic achievements, which are quite remarkable. As you know, it has created a directly elected parliament representing 450 million citizens across 27 countries, established a mechanism for cooperation among member states, and developed a quite complex system of checks and balances between its institutions. It has successfully integrated new democracies. It has strengthened civil society networks across borders. It has created unprecedented opportunities for citizen participation in supranational decision-making. But there's always a but, right? The EU's democratic journey has not been without challenges. And we've heard a lot about the democratic deficit of the EU. And this maybe points to genuine concerns. The complexity of EU institutions can feel remote from citizens' daily lives. Technical policy making sometimes appears to overshadow democratic deliberation, and national interests, as interpreted by governments, can clash with broader European aspirations. So, and we've seen recent challenges like Brexit that have exposed some of these tensions. This first panel will explore these successes and shortcomings. It will examine how the EU's democratic experience can inform broader debates about democracy in an era of enormous global challenges, which demand coordinated action. Later today, we'll have the second part of this webinar, which will focus on the UN. And then this afternoon, we'll hand over the mic to campaigners from civil society working for a more democratic, inclusive, and participatory UN. But back to the here and now for this panel, an all-women panel, by the way. We have 4 amazing speakers. I will introduce them in alphabetical order. By name, first name. So the first one is Daniela Van Sik. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Daniela. If not, please correct me. But Daniela has been the European Program Manager at Democracy International since 2017, where she works on European democracy and citizen participation in decision-making. Daniela is an expert on the European Citizens Initiative, and in 2022, she co-edited a book called Complementary Democracy. She previously worked as a campaign manager for the Michigan Democratic Party and is actively involved with the Regional Democrats Abroad organization on voter mobilization efforts for Americans living abroad. Oh, quite interesting. Then we have Eleonora Poli. She's head of the Italian office at the Center for European Policy Network and Associate Fellow at the Italian Institute of International Affairs. She has worked as senior political analyst and communication expert for several prominent companies, NGOs, and think tanks in Italy, the UK, and internationally. Eleonora holds a PhD in international political economy from City University London, and she is the author of Antitrust, Institutions and Policies in the Globalizing Economy, as well as of several book chapters, opinion pieces, articles, and analysis on political trends and economic policies. Third, we have Elisa Lironi. She is a program director for European democracy working at the European Citizen Action Service since 2015. She implements EU projects and services related to digital democracy, populism, and civic engagement. She conducts research on e-participation, and her latest publications include 2 book chapters on crowdsourcing, one on crowdsourcing a constitution in Iceland, and another one on crowdsourcing EU legislation. Elisa also leads the Civil Society Europe's digital transformation cluster that brought civil society proposals to the Conference on the Future of Europe and continues to feed into the EU's priority of a Europe fit for the digital age. Since 2018, she is the ECI, European Citizens Initiative, expert and project manager of the European Citizens Initiative Forum. So we'll be asking you a lot of questions about the Citizens Initiative, but also about crowdsourcing. I'm quite curious about that. And last but not least, we have Ophélie Masson, who coordinates European alternatives programs aimed at developing and implementing sustainable tools of participative democracy, such as citizens' assemblies and European citizens' initiatives. She also coordinates a Citizens Take Over Europe coalition. She focuses on defining new common narratives for citizens and residents of Europe who wish to enhance their political participation through innovative processes. Ophélie is also an LGBTQI activist and chair of the board of the International LGBTQI Youth and Student Organization, which groups over 120 organizations in 40 countries. So we have a lot to discuss. This panel will have a conversational format. I will ask several rounds of questions to our 4 panelists, and then we'll tackle the questions that we received from the audience. You're all welcome to write your questions in the chat or otherwise wait to take the mic and ask them in the last half hour of the webinar, where we'll have a discussion. So I know this has been a very long introduction. Let's get started. We'll start with a diagnosis. So I'll ask a first quite general question to all the speakers, which is, what do you make of the critique that there is a democratic deficit at the EU level? What is the state of citizen participation in the EU? What works, what doesn't work? If there are any deficits to be addressed, where do you think they primarily lie? And I guess I can choose who starts. Maybe Eleonora would like to start.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Ines, for inviting me to such an interesting event. I'm very happy to be here with you, although I would prefer to be there physically, but maybe next time. Well, let's start by saying, when we talk about, the democratic trend within the EU, we have to look at the broader picture. Certainly, we are living in very interesting time if you are like a social, economic, or political experts. But you know, living in this time is also very challenging. We all know that we are experiencing different kind of crises that are intermatched, one on the top of the other. When it comes to the EU specifically, of course, we have been living different years or different kind of economic crisis in the last 10 years, you know, the credit crunch, then, you know, debt crisis, then, you know, the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic over the economy, and also now the consequence of the Ukrainian war, so the Russian invasion on Ukraine, which has, you know, deep economic consequences in terms of inflations, but also the rise of oil prices. Interrelated to that, there is also security crisis in the sense that after many years, the EU is experiencing a war on its borders, basically, and we don't have an European army to defend us. So we have to rely on NATO and on foreign actors, on other actors. And the international level, there is also, you know, a constant competition between, you know, China and the US, and the EU is somehow in the middle of this war. And at the same time, we are experiencing a lack of competitiveness on many fronts. There is the consequences of the pandemic crisis to be faced, and also of the digital revolution. So many factors are creating insecurity on European citizens. The problem is that the cost of those crises and the level of insecurity is impacting the most the low middle class, which represent also the majority of the citizens. And this is somehow linked also to the level of trust in the national and European institutions. If you look at the data, you see that the majority of citizens coming from the lower middle class, those citizens that don't trust European institutions, the majority, they don't trust European institutions, and they don't even trust national institutions, so the parliaments and the governments. Major trust is coming from the upper class. So the upper class has faith in the European institution and national governments. How this is related to the democratic participation? Of course, if you don't trust in institutions, political institutions, being there at national or European level, you are not also, you know, interested in knowing more about the functioning and ways to participate to the decision-making process. This doesn't mean that citizens are not voting or are giving up on democracy. No, you know, if you look at the last European parliamentary elections, you see that there is a tiny increase in the number of citizens, you know, trying to participate, you know, to the vote. So of course, if there is a crisis, citizens tend to participate more to elections in order to have a say. But the problem is that the consequence of such a huge participation of angry citizens result in a rise of ultra-right populist parties, which most of the time are anti-European or very critical on the European Union, or they want the European Union to become just a sort of a union of nation states representing, you know, national interests or national egoism. How we should counteract to such a trend? Well, the problem is that there is a number of, and we are going to discuss it, there is a number of institutions or mechanisms that would allow, you know, citizens to have a say directly to the European Union, but there is low knowledge about those mechanisms and also low literacy and probably low trust, in the sense that citizens do not believe that their participation or their voice would be listened at the European level. And this need to be tackled not just on a top-down mechanism, so from the European institution to the citizens, but at local, regional, national level, because most of the time, and in the past, it was because of national government that the European citizens started to trust less the European Union, because national governments, and Brexit is a very good example, have been using the European Union for many years as a scapegoat for the national issues. You know, they were implementing painful reform because of the European Union, because the European Union was asking it. And most of the time, this was not exactly the reality. Thank you, Ines.
Thank you, Leonora. I mean, this I will keep this this thing that you said about, you know, the problem of the participation of angry citizens. This is something we need to talk about more. But let's hear Daniela first, and then the rest of the speakers, and then we'll move on to the solutions.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. And yeah, hello also to the friendly faces on the panel and the others that are following. So it's a very fully loaded question, but maybe just to pick up where Eleonora left off, because I think it was really spot on about the consequences of dissatisfied voters going to the polls, voting for the European Parliament elections. And we do see that we have the far right has significantly increased their share of the vote in the European Parliament, and therefore that brings back more nationalistic tendencies now in the European Parliament that we need to be alert of. So there's a lot of red flags, I think we can also call it. But as far as instruments go, there's always room for improvement, but we always start from a point of a little bit critique. We start from a point of deficit, but maybe just to bring a new, a different perspective, we have some instruments at EU level that we don't even have here where I live in Germany at national level. And that's like a citizens initiative, right? And I know Elisa is also going to talk a lot more about the European Citizens Initiative, but basically a right of citizens to petition their government. We say petition, but it's much stronger than the word petition. Think a little bit like Swiss style of initiatives. We don't have this even at national level in Germany. We have this very actively at local level, at regional level, but even there, we have this now at European level, and it's the first and still only transnational tool of participatory democracy that we have. It's an argument whether it's really direct democracy. I mean, citizens could be much more directly involved there. There is an obligation for the Commission to respond to successful European citizens initiatives. I know Elisa will talk about that more. We can increase. I mean, when we talk about a starting point for democracy and how to decrease that democratic deficit, I say we don't have to start from square one. We use the instruments that we have and we try to expand their scope, and we try to expand the directness or the political impactness of those instruments. And that's one like the ECI, who has had political impact in some ways, but also somewhat limited. So I mean, we can point back to several points of legislation that has had a positive impact on EU law, but we would also like to see more for an instrument with so much more potential, and so that at the end, that is always a little bit of a political decision. So we want to take the political decision out of a lot of these instruments and make it that the citizens actually have a citizens initiative right, and that was a little bit the imagination for the European Citizens Initiative when it was lobbied into law 20 years ago. Now we've had it since 2012. So I just want to put that on the table, because I know we're going to speak a lot about democratic deficit, and I agree there's so much more we need to do. We can definitely improve it, but maybe a point to start is the instruments we already have. European citizens panels as well. We'll probably talk about that in a little bit more detail over the next 2 hours. But those at the moment, the European Commission has done European citizens panels in the form of like citizens assemblies, randomly selected, and those are done at a very top-down way. And there are definitely ways you can bring that bottom up, meaning you involve citizens from the start, you involve civil society in that process, and these things are not impossible to do. It exists out there. There are already instruments like that out there. We know that it's tried and true, so it's not even too experimental anymore at this stage. But agreed, there's so many more innovations, democratic innovations that we could implement, that we could improve to close that democratic deficit that we have at EU level. And maybe I leave with a quote I heard last week that says, "Our democracy is still in the Middle Ages." That we focus so much, our democracy is so focused around elections, and of course they are one of the most consequential things that we have in democracy. So we need to make sure our elections are first and foremost like secure, safe, and legitimate, and all of that, and protected. But in addition to that, we can't just wait every 5-year election cycle, 4-year election cycle, to not introduce new instruments or improve the instruments that we have. And so yeah, I would just leave you with, I think we need to modernize those those tools that we have, start from there. We don't need to start from scratch.
Thank you, Daniela. And Elisa, you were mentioned several times, so I guess it's your turn to have your say.
Yes, thank you very much, Ines, and thank you, Daniela. We work actually on the European Citizens Initiative together, so maybe that's why she has been mentioning me. Yeah, I wanted to pick up a bit from what has already been said by Eleonora and also by Daniela. I think that when we talk about democratic deficit, of course, today maybe we will follow a bit more like participatory democracy solutions, but of course, as Eleonora was saying, it goes beyond that, right? Because what we've been seeing in the European Union in the latest years has also been a lot of corruption, for example, Qatargate, or also promises that were not being kept, for example, with the Spitzenkandidaten during the European elections. And this has, as Eleonora was also saying, has led to less trust also in institutions, less trust in politicians, populist movements gaining a lot of traction, and unfortunately also in the latest elections, a lot of far-right movements and politicians gaining votes. And so we need to try to understand and try to mitigate the next risks that are coming in the future of the EU, and how do we do that? I think that when we talk about the European Union and the politics around it, it adds a level of complexity, because it was already mentioned by Eleonora that the lack of civic education as a mandatory discipline in schools is a huge problem. Already, I think that citizens don't really know how decision-making processes work at their national level, but when we put it up to the European level, it adds this layer of complexity. Most people don't really know how the Commission functions, the European Parliament. It was already said that, you know, many politicians also blame Brussels for whatever happens in their country, and this is not always the case. And so how do we actually try to fill in this deficit with possible solutions? Well, we were talking about the problems, right? So I think that first of all is the lack of knowledge about the EU, and how do we do, you know, how do we fill in this knowledge of citizens? But also I think that there's this big disconnect, and also the fact that many young people, what we've seen is not anymore content about representative democracy. And this was also mentioned by Daniela. There is this new trend of more participation, more elements of direct democracy in what we call the representative democracy based on elections. So what are the solutions there? You know, what does participatory democracy mean? And the European Union has a few official tools. One of them has been mentioned. It's the European Citizens Initiative, which we will talk about afterwards. But there are also the online public consultations of the European Commission, the online petitions of the European Parliament, and then Daniela will also be talking about the citizens' assemblies, which was the latest one from Ursula von der Leyen that started off with her. The problem is that this toolbox is not very big. There are only 4 official mechanisms. And another problem that I would add to that is what concrete impact do citizens actually have in policymaking processes when they use these tools? So we have a problem of limited tools, but also the impact that they actually have. So, and then I also have to say that there are possibilities with these tools to also reach out to target groups such as young people that also have a new way of thinking of democracy. This is taken from research around young people. We see young people much more individualistic in society. You know, we've lost centers of community such as religion, churches, I mean, everything that we think. And if we think of the society that is today, it is much more individualistic. So we do see a lot of young people that are on the streets fighting for very specific topics that they care about. So maybe young people go less to vote, but this doesn't mean that they're not interested in politics. They just have a different form of also wanting to be part of democracy. And this has to be taken into consideration. And my last point is the digital, because my expertise is really around digital democracy. We see how these digital tools can be used and abused also by, politicians, by stakeholders, etc. So I think the future looks a bit bleak, to be honest, when we also look at how the US elections ended with a coupling of, Donald Trump and Elon Musk. How do we make sure that big tech is regulated to also follow the values of the EU? We all know the problems of fake news, social media, and everything. So I'm just adding a few problems, and then I guess that later we can discuss about the solutions.
Thank you, Elisa. And Ophelia, I think I'm putting you in a tough position to come at last, but at least you will have the last word. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And apologies because I haven't been so responsive in preparing, so apologies for that. So my name is Ophélie. I work with European Alternatives and also with Citizens Take Over Europe. So I have both hats when I'm speaking here about popular participation. So I will just react mostly to what kind of tools we've been promoting as an EU instrument, and how actually we also see the limits of using this as an EU instrument, which is citizen assemblies or popular assemblies. Citizen assemblies is the most widespread common term, but I believe that it's not inclusive enough, because not everyone has the privilege of holding citizenship and yet lives in the EU and is a full civic actor in the EU. So using the term popular assemblies just seems more inclusive. So we see, as it was mentioned before, like in the last EU elections that we had in June this year, there was a very low turnout. I mean, it was 50.74%, I think, which is one of the highest ever, but yet is only barely half of the registered voters. And as we know, registered voters are not also the whole of the population. So it shows how little legitimacy this gives to our elected representatives, and they know it, and they're quite ashamed of it, I think. At the same time, they are the ones who are being put in this position of power by being elected members of the European Parliament, and so they do sit in that parliament with half a feeling probably of pride of having been elected, and half of a feeling of perhaps guilt of knowing that they're representing actually a quite small sample of the population and of the population's interests. So starting from there, I think that what we call participative democracy is just, it's a must if we want to expect that the minimum trust in democratic institutions persists, and that our EU institutions just remain as relevant as possible for the political system that we have in place. As we know, democracy is not the best system, but yet this is the best we have for now. Same goes, in my opinion, for our economic model. Capitalism is not the best economic system ever, yet so far this is the best we have, with all its flaws. So starting from this point of view, we've had a look quite closely at how we can use popular assemblies to bridge that gap and to potentially restore a bit of that trust and engage more the population with their institutions. We've done that at EU level, which is something that we'll go into deeper after, but I think it's very important when we talk about popular assemblies at what level we want to implement them. And in doing so, which population we are actually able to involve. So you might have heard of the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is this initiative that was mentioned before, that started with Ursula von der Leyen in her first mandate as President of the Commission, and who proposed this idea of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Then COVID hit, and so this conference, which we call in abbreviation COFOE, or coffee, depending on how we want to pronounce it. This initiative was supposed to be 2-year-long initiative, and then with COVID, it was reduced to a 1-year-long initiative, COVID was the excuse mentioned, and we'll never know if it's the real one. And then this process had great promises. And it's true, it was the first ever popular panel, well, citizens assemblies organized at EU level by the institutions. And so on that, the promise was delivered. They actually happened. And those assemblies were organized in collaboration with some actors from civil society. They involved experts, and they were transnational. They involved citizens from the 27 EU member states. That being said, of course, there are huge limits to that instrument. One being, of course, that they were not representative. It's a bias. Because, of course, what is crucial when we talk about popular assemblies and citizen assemblies is how the participants are selected. The European Commission mandated a private company called Kantar, with a K. And it's that company that did the selection of participants with the data that they had available probably in their hands at that point. But we can see that this system just is untenable on the longer term. The people who were sampled in those assemblies were very white. There was an imbalance in the social class origin of people and in the age. So we can see that it was not representative of the actual EU population, and also because only people holding citizenship were able to be selected. And we know that we have a growing migration population, as it should, and those people were absolutely not represented in the assemblies. The COFOE was followed by European citizens panels, which are still ongoing. They have quite random topics. The first one organized was on food waste. Sure, probably an interesting and important topic, but a bit random. So the selection of topics is a bit strange and untransparent. So we have those initiatives happening at EU level, but popular assemblies are also happening at other levels, such as national level. We saw it in France about climate. It happened in Ireland also at national level, which led to the legislation legalizing the right to abortion. And it also happens at municipality level. The city of Brussels, for instance, is a good example of that. And in some other cities also across the EU. But we can see that those assemblies turn out somehow to be way more representative and effective when being done at a more local level. But maybe we can talk about that more in the solutions aspect.
Maybe thanks, Ophelia. I think you get a little bit ahead of my next question. So let's get back to you on that. Well, I mean, from what I'm hearing, it seems that some, if not all of you, would agree with the idea that, the cure for the ills of democracy is, well, more democracy, right? And so I would like to hear you speak a little bit more about this participatory, deliberative mechanisms that you've studied and how they actually work. So first about, the idea, why they were a good idea to begin with, how they were supposed to work, and then how they actually work. And you already said a few things about that, Ophelia, so let's go in the opposite order and start with you, and then go back to the other speakers. I would like to deepen a little bit our analysis of, the citizen, or better, popular assemblies, and how they have been implemented, what impact they've had, and also if they're, as you said, I mean, these are, and you can explain a little bit more how they are supposed to work. These are mechanisms of deliberative democracy, and people are supposed to be a statistic representatively, right? I mean, they are a statistic sample from the population. They are supposed to create conditions for deliberation that are not found outside, like in the real world. And so just get common people deliberate on important issues, right? And it sounds like a great idea. So what are the shortcomings in the way it has been implemented?
So thank you, Ines. So, I mean, first I want to start by saying that I'm being friendly critic of this process that was set up by the Commission. Again, like there are many flaws and critiques that can be brought up about the Conference on the Future of Europe, for instance. That being said, I'm also aware that we have to keep in mind that this was a first. It was the first time that the EU was organizing such a process. And it happened. It actually happened. And so we can perfect it. We can improve it. And I think it's already a good sign that it happened in the first place. And it shows or showed, at least during the first mandate of von der Leyen, a will to invest also financially, because those assemblies have quite high costs, into participative democracy. So that being said, as I mentioned, like it was not representative enough, and the results coming out of those assemblies, well, are not binding, and that's the real issue. And I'm sure that's the issue that other colleagues on the panel here have with the ECI, which is that it's just not a binding instrument, at least not yet. So whatever comes out of an assembly, just like the Commission doesn't have the duty to act upon the results, which is a real shame. So after the Conference on the Future of Europe, we ended up with 49 recommendations. Some of them, the Commission said was very proud of having implemented those, but in reality, we know that they were already files that were already on their desk before the start of the Conference on the Future of Europe. So they were actually already in the intention of working on those files. Then the other recommendations just probably will not see the light of day, or not anytime soon. Also because some of them would require treaty change, which is of course a whole other project. So out of these recommendations, what we can expect now is that the European citizen panels, so which is the second phase of a participative process that is being put in place, would pick up on those recommendations and would encourage the Commission to table on them. But that's a very light expectation. And same goes for digital participative democracy. So in the parallel of holding those assemblies, there was an online platform. On the online platform, it worked like it was quite hard to access. You had to create an account. Creating the account just in itself took 15 minutes. So I wonder who would be motivated enough to push through and spend 15 minutes to create an account. And then once you were on the platform, you could, share whatever messages you wanted to share, recommendations. Then those recommendations in the hope of having an impact would have to be picked up by the moderating team, which would then be discussed in a popular assembly, in a citizen assembly, and then perhaps being put through to the secretariat of the process of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and then perhaps end up in the final report. So this is just to show the long path, way too long path for it to be called participative democracy, because this is just too much of taking a chance for your idea to make it from the tip of your fingers on your keyboard to the actual final report. So that's a limitation here. We have seen this process being organized, as I mentioned, on national and regional and local level. And we can see, for instance, in the example of the city of Brussels that operates with citizen assemblies more and more, that those assemblies are way more effective because they are fully embedded into the institutions of the municipality. And so they are binding, and the results of the assemblies are directly taken upon by the representatives, so by elected representatives. So there's a clear communication, there's a clear conversation between people sitting in the citizen assembly and the representative elected politicians. And that's the hope that I would have for citizen assemblies or popular assemblies at an EU level, and for making it potentially a permanent EU instrument. I think it only makes sense if there is a binding element into it. It doesn't mean that it needs to be all upon the decision of a citizen assembly, of course, but we could imagine a new institution that would be the citizen assembly, that would work as a 50-50 power balance with the European Parliament. That's pretty revolutionary. That's pretty bold. But let's dream and let's be ambitious. And we could expect to have a dual system, a bicameral system between an institutionalized citizen assembly and the European Parliament. That would also give way more power eventually to the European Parliament. And I would hope that our elected representatives in the Parliament would see it that way, because that would give more power and more legitimacy to whatever recommendations they would come up with together in comparison with the European Commission or the Council of Europe, because that's also a big problem we have at the moment in this trial institution system in the EU, which is that the European Parliament realistically weighs way less than the two other institutions, which ends up in a situation where the voices of citizens are even less heard. We can also see that those assemblies are very successful in smaller realities. And of course, they are way more easily implementable and representative when they are implemented at smaller levels. I'm thinking also of an example outside of the EU, but not too far, which is in Switzerland, which is, of course, a groundbreaking land for participative democracy, with also their voting system, direct voting system and referendums. And this is also, I think, a model that we could get inspiration from to implement at regional level, not necessarily EU level.
Many thanks, Ophélie. So just one follow-up question. So you mentioned, besides the problem that decisions of the assemblies are not binding, you also mentioned that when it was first attempted, there were problems with the samples, that the samples weren't truly representative. And in one way, you mentioned migrants, and definitely, I mean, that's because they were not in the pool of potential, members of the assemblies. But are there any other problems with the samples that maybe the technology itself is biased? Is there any way we can design these mechanisms to ensure meaningful inclusion of marginalized voices? I mean, I'm thinking also about your experience with LGBTQI advocacy and whether you see any way those voices would also be represented.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, there's of course another big limitation for people to participate is money, because for people to participate in those assemblies, it means taking time off work for those who can. Well, just being able to take the time, because in the process of, for instance, the conference on the future of Europe, people were receiving a stipend, a daily stipend to be able to attend the assembly, and their travel costs were covered. That being said, still, it doesn't mean that everyone is able to take time off work with the reason of I'm going to participate in a panel or an assembly. That's just not flying with every employer. So there's that limitation, of course, which is an economical and social background reason that would be limiting people from participating. And well, although great that the Commission could pay for that, when assemblies are organized at CSO level, of course, often CSOs just do not have the means to compensate financially for people to participate in such processes. And for assemblies happening at smaller levels, so national level, regional, local level, the budgets usually also do not allow for that. So there's that limitation. And then when it comes to the diversity, also in terms of racialized diversity, that was also an issue regardless of citizenship, also for people holding citizenship. And that's a limitation that is way more complex because some member states, such as France, do not allow for data based on race, for the collection of data based on race. It's a whole topic, of course, it's a whole conversation in itself, but that's also potentially a system that we could see the limits of.
Okay, wonderful. So I would like, if you can mention like really short, but I'm curious about the Citizens Take Over Europe initiative. Was it in reaction to what you saw as shortcomings from the conference on the future of Europe? What was it exactly? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes, I'm happy to say a few words, but also if Daniela wants to come in, because Daniela is also a member of Citizens Take Over Europe, so I would be happy also to give her the floor, and was actually there before me at the very start of it. But in short words, yes, the Citizens Take Over Europe coalition was created in reaction to the creation of the conference on the future of Europe. And we monitored closely how the conference was going, and we were critical friends of that conference in issuing statements and meeting up with the secretariat of the conference to also try and improve the process as it was going. Then a one-year process is actually quite short, so it's quite short to be able to change things while they're going, but at least we have a lot of learnings for a potential second conference on the future of Europe. But Daniela, please, if you want to add a few words.
Yeah, please go ahead, Daniela.
Yeah, I'm happy, and then I can also pick up on some of the things that Ophelia mentioned. So really, Citizens Take Over Europe, and we came as a direct result of the conference on the future of Europe. So once the conference on the future of Europe was announced by Ursula von der Leyen, as Elisa mentioned at the beginning, then a group of, now we're 60 civil society organizations came together and said, basically, we need to create like a little bit of a watchdog status over the implementation of this conference on the future of Europe, because President von der Leyen promised that citizens would be at the center of it, and we wanted to make sure we wouldn't lose that, or that some recommendations would get watered down over the process. So basically, a group of us, myself included, we were observers in this process. So we went to Strasbourg, we went to wherever they were held, actually all around Europe, the different citizens panels, and then where the plenaries were held, and we really observed this process on the ground, and we had interviews, and we really checked the process out and looked how we can improve it. And that's what we did. We did like a lot of statements that we issued and open letters and mobilized around that topic. And maybe now to shift over also to the question. So that's, if there's anything I would say from this really historic conference on the future of Europe, which, you know, we criticize with a friendly eye, but still really acknowledge like the historicalness aspect of it, because it brought in not only citizens together with members of European Parliament, which in some settings they've already exchanged, but also now members of national parliaments. And that's something we never before have seen at EU history, that we brought members of national parliaments to Strasbourg, like members of the Bundestag from here in Germany, who also now learned about the functioning of Europe and took this back to their national parliaments, also together with EU council members and so on. So really all of the different political actors and civil society, I forgot to mention, all of this plus citizens and civil society came together in one room to deliberate over the course of this 1 year. Well, this plenary aspect took really the last few months, but this was really historical. This was really unique. We'd love to replicate this again, you know, in another way. I mean, do we need to have a conference on the future of Europe every single year? It's a lot of work, and I heard it was very, very expensive. But I think it makes sense to do something maybe every mandate in some version of it. And now that we know how it works, and I'm sure that there's ways to cut corners to make it a lot more efficient than it ran last time. But I think the most consequential, or let's say the most concrete response that we have from the conference on the future of Europe, the consequence of it is the European citizens panels. And that's the process that Ophelia was explaining now, is the EU level deliberation panels, randomly selected citizens assemblies, where the random selection could also be done much better. Though I'm also myself, I'm not a sortition purist. So sortition meaning the process of random selection. I don't think we need to have pure random selection. Actually, I would even advise against it, depending on the topic, because, for example, if you have a topic like immigration and asylum, I just don't think it's right not to have immigrants and asylum seekers in that room, and not just one or two, you know, token people, but you need to have like proportionally overrepresented number of people who are the most affected on the topic that assembly is dealing with. So I would say in some cases, we don't need to have pure representation. We need to have, in some cases, also over-representation of some groups of the population. I think this is dealt with on a case-by-case basis, because we need to see what the topic is, of course. On the conference on the future of Europe, one thing that I will also give credit to, and I think that this was good, and this wasn't even a push by civil society or those. There was an overrepresentation of youth. So there was 1/4, 1/3, I can't remember exactly the number now. I think 1/3 of every panel was people aged 16 to 25. And I think that's great because we're talking about the future of Europe, and what's the future if not young people? So they should have more of a seat at the table. But yeah, definitely some lessons learned to be there. Maybe the last thing I also just want to mention with deliberation, with these EU practices. So we have so many also good examples. European citizens panels are the only ones that we have at EU level. But I think if we really want to improve them, we can look at what has been happening at national level, local and regional level, because there's so many more positive examples there. And I know Elisa knows also more about those, but just to highlight the Irish case, because the Irish Citizens Assembly is the one that we always consider the gold standard when it comes to citizens' assemblies. And it's not just because the process that they had. I mean, the process was also really great. We also had a chance to do really a in-depth study tour of how they organize the assembly. I mean, just to list one example, they had experts when it came to a topic. They had pro and con experts. So for example, the famous Citizens Assembly on abortion, which led to the legalization of or decriminalization of abortion in Ireland. They had experts pro and against the abortion topic. So religious leaders, from doctors, from women who have suffered severe pain from not receiving the abortion care they needed, the families of the women who passed away from not receiving it. So really on all sides of the spectrum, this was heard. And at the end, there was a referendum on that topic, on the abortion topic, because you also needed in Ireland to change the constitution. And the report from the Citizens Assembly, this is really interesting, the report from the Citizens Assembly on the abortion topic passed by 66%. So the recommendations, I said, we recommend to undo this law in the Constitution. We recommend to bring forward to allow abortion access. It passed by 66%. When they had the referendum, it passed by 66%. So it showed that when you really have like a wide ranging of views, you have proper deliberation, like proper pro con arguments, let people really, don't take people for granted. They can really come up with good, their with recommendations, that the final result in the whole of population of Ireland really represented what that small sliver in that Citizens Assembly, that 100 people that were chosen on a much smaller scale. And I would say too, the last thing I would mention just about bindingness on this, maybe this is a little bit controversial sometimes in this circles, but I don't think that the European Citizens panels or the European Citizens Initiative should be 100% binding, not in the form they are today. And that's for a simple reason, because I don't think that with the European Citizens Initiative that we'll talk about, that needs 1 million people, with a European Citizens panel or a Citizens Assembly, popular assembly, that's, let's say, I don't know, 250 people, that's not a majority of the population. I certainly don't want 1 out of 250 then to also decide on my potential rights or so on. To make it, I think if we really want to make it binding, 100% binding, political impact is one thing. We should increase their political impact, I agree. But if we want to make them fully binding, we need to do what Ireland did. And that is you introduce a referendum. And you don't introduce a referendum falling from the sky, like Brexit style. You do it Irish style, where you have a deliberation process where you fully talk about it. People understand, they look at the report by their peers that they trust, over politicians, and then they can come up with a proper response and vote on that. And then I think that's, of course, a referendum that should be then binding. But I think that is the good recipe for how to bring a binding topic from the bottom up.
Thank you, Daniela. Well, I think you clarified the doubt that I had, because I thought, what are citizens panel and how are they different from citizen assemblies, right? And they are the same thing. They are basically citizen assemblies organized by the European Commission, right? They call it differently. Probably assembly sounds too radical, so they prefer to call them panels, but they are the same thing, right? It's interesting what you say about the Irish process. Definitely in that case, probably a key was the way I mean, the decisions were in the assembly were not binding, but the way they had an impact, and the way they were used as input for public deliberation, like, you know, that's probably, I mean, these things that didn't remain, you know, between four walls, in, you know, just basically they were what fed the public discussion, public narratives about the issue. So maybe that's what's missing at the EU level. Well, I'm sorry we changed the order, but it seemed that only natural that you followed Ophélie. But let's go back to Elisa. You have been actively engaged with one of the EU's official tools for transnational participation, the European Citizens Initiative, that's already been mentioned a few times. So it would be great if you could explain exactly what this is, how it is supposed to work, how it has worked in practice, you know, specifically how much it has been used, on what issues it has been used, with what results.
Yeah, sure. Shall I go? Yes. Okay. So yes, the European Citizens Initiative has been mentioned a few times, and I don't know how many people in this meeting actually knows what it is, so maybe I'll just say what it is. It's basically a petitions mechanism. I mean, it is a way for European citizens to launch an initiative, meaning something that the Commission can legislate upon. So this is very important. Like, it is, I'll just call it like a petitions mechanism in which at least 7 citizens resident in different member states, because it is a transnational tool, can come together, decide to launch an initiative on almost an exclusive competence of the Commission. And then if in 1 year they manage to gather 1 million signatures, then the Commission is obligated to answer to the citizens on how it will take it into consideration. Now, I dosed my words here very carefully because the Treaty of Lisbon is where the European Citizens Initiative has been introduced. And then, as Danielle already mentioned, it was then officialized, let's say, in 2012. So it's, you know, it's a bit more than a decade that has been running. And in the beginning, people were really, really disappointed with the tool because of the impact, which was also mentioned by Ophélie, because they could see that even after 1 million signatures, for example, the Commission can initiate a legislative procedure on that topic, but it is not obliged to. And this, it is not obliged to, just de facto made it never happen, in the sense that technically, like, the Commission has never initiated a legislative procedure on any citizens initiative that received 1 million signatures. So how many are we actually talking about? So we're in 2024, 2025 almost. So since 2012, there have been, let's say, more than 100 of them that were launched. And let's say only 10 of them kind of were successful in getting 1 million signatures. So you can see the percentage is like super low. Why is that? Because in order to get this 1 million signatures, which is already a huge amount of signatures, you still need to reach a certain threshold in at least 7 different member states, which makes the campaigning very, very complex. Because obviously, if you're having a petition here in the city of Brussels and you just need Brussels citizens, it's very easy to reach, you can do it. But if you're running a transnational tool like the Citizens Initiative, you need to get European citizens to actually be willing to push the cause forward. And that means that you need, at least 7 different countries and a certain amount of signatures to represent that country. So there are lots of complexities. Another complexity is the fact of launching the initiative itself, because it has to be exclusive competence of the Commission. So many people don't really know, like, for example, education. It's a hot topic. Everyone wants civic education and stuff. They want to launch the initiative at the EU level. It's very tricky because education is actually a national competence. So if you want to launch something on defense, it is not an exclusive competence of the Commission. So already there, launching the initiative for citizens can be very technical, very difficult. So how do we actually work as a civil society like ECAS to help citizens? So we coordinate the European Citizens Initiative Forum, which is a support center, let's call it. Then we help European citizens actually use the tool. And so together also with Democracy International, we give them support through static material that can be found on the ECI forum, but also dynamic guidance, which means that there is a seek advice section where people can ask us to go to certain lawyers and see if the initiative they want to launch falls under the competence of the EU. So just to say that as a civil society, we can help also as mediators sometimes between the citizens and policymakers by helping people use participatory tools at the EU level. So this is one way that we're bringing people to be more in participatory democracy and to use democracy tools much more. So I heard also what Ophélie was saying about the impact, and I am not as negative as that. I do think that it is a fair point. I mean, one of the main backlashes that we've seen with the Citizens Initiative in the beginning, and if you look at the chart, you'll see that there was a huge amount of people using the Citizens Initiative in the beginning, and then it dropped because there was a huge disappointment. There's no impact. Why am I using it? It takes us so much effort to campaign, etc. And then at a certain point, you see it go back up. So why is it that now citizens are actually using the tool again? And the reason being that citizens have realized that even if there is no impact, concrete impact at the EU level in the sense of legislation process, it doesn't mean that it hasn't had impact. So for example, we always mention one of the first ones that managed to get 1 million signatures was called Right to Water. It was against the privatization of water. It didn't have an EU impact in the sense of starting a legislation. But the Commission, in the years after the initiative, they actually took it and revised the directive concerning water, taking as inspiration what citizens were calling for. And then I'm Italian, and I can tell you that in those years that this was being launched by citizens and being run by citizens, we were having in Italy discussions around the privatization of water. And because of the Citizens Initiative, and Italians were also part of the Citizens Initiative, the government was very careful about the legislation on privatization of water because they saw that there was a movement bottom up that was calling against the privatization. So sometimes even if we don't see tangible results at the EU level on what we expect in the short term, this doesn't mean that these tools don't have impact. So now when we talk to citizens and we ask them why they're launching these tools, they tell us we use it because it's a good campaigning tool. I'm working together with other citizens all across Europe to push for a cause that I believe in. And this bottom-up process means something. And it is good to have these possibilities existing. Even if people don't see concrete impact that they would like, they still use the tool because in some way they raise awareness. In some ways, they get to meet policymakers across Europe to also talk about the discussion. And it is already much more than just sitting at home and waiting for the next elections to talk about voting. So this is kind of where we stand as well with the European Citizens Initiative, with Democracy International. Yeah, and we have other suggestions. So if you have the follow-up question, I mean, I'm also willing to talk about other proposals that we have on crowdsourcing, etc.
Wonderful, Elisa. We'll get back to you with a question about what else we could do if there are any potential other potential democratic innovations worth considering. But before that, I would like to hear from Eleonora, because I think Eleonora, you have been working also on Citizens Initiative, and we've already seen a couple different positions about the Citizens Initiative, and especially discussion about how to measure impact. Maybe we need a more nuanced way of looking at impact. But I would like to see if we have three different visions of the European Citizens Initiative here. If you see any other downsides in the way it's being used, if you see there's any changes needed in the way it's implemented, would like to hear from you.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that on principle, I agree a lot with what Elisa was saying, that it's good to have those mechanisms. Actually, the Citizens Initiative is a mechanism that was already present at national level. So many member states had already or still have, ways for citizens, to somehow apply for regulation or specific focus. So it's fundamental to have it, at the European level. And in fact, it was part of the Lisbon Treaty in this respect. It's not just a nice to have tool, but it's a necessary tool, to have, a functioning and also legitimate democracy. Having said that, yes, there are a lot of negative side of it. First of all, I would say that, as I was mentioning before, is not really effective because there is low literacy. According to the statistics, the 58% of the European citizens do not know about, this mechanism, and 39%, even if they know that there is this citizens initiative or mechanism for participation, they cannot explain the mechanism, so they don't know how to use it. So, you see a very huge majority of people that do not understand how they can participate. And this is part of the low literacy problem we were mentioning before. So, of course, the presence of think tanks, international organization, local organization, actively involved in this process is fundamental, because those organizations most of the time can be the link, between, upper institutions and the citizens by providing tools, information, etc., etc. So again, it's not just up to the European Union to centralize this sharing of information. Is also up to citizens and organizations, to be properly involved. What I would say also, there is a level of fragmentation. It's true that there are not many mechanisms that can be used by citizens. Still there are some, there is consultation, citizens initiatives, the panel, petitions, and this can be confusing, for citizens, in the sense that having different channels to intervene through different, institutions is not easy. Finally, my understanding is that there are a bit detached from the political day-to-day process, in the sense that if it takes 1 year to have, at least 1 year, to collect the signature and then have it present to the Commission that is going to answer, makes, the issue a bit more detached from, global trends, which are very fast, So today we talk about climate change, tomorrow is going to be the war, and the day after is going to be something else, So it's true that it's good to raise concern about, an issue. Elisa was mentioning water, and of course, these are fundamental issues. Still, the risk is that being detached from the everyday, political discussions and debates, they will lose focus and also level of awareness. And finally, there is also, I think, a problem of unequal access, which is related to, as I said, low literacy, but also geographical concentration of where those initiatives are launched. It's true that you need 7 citizens from 7 different countries to launch the initiatives, but the majority normally are the higher levels of participation is normally in Italy, France, Germany. So in the older Europe, the older member countries, where you don't see many voices coming from the new member states or the newest member states, which possibly have a different vision about the future of the European Union, because they enter in the European Union when, the party was already over, when, the economy was not growing and, the benefits were less and less. So they also come from, a different historical and political background. So they might have another vision about the future of the European Union. How to overcome those issues? First of all, I would say that, as I said, it's important to have those mechanisms. It's fundamental for me to have a functioning democracy. So I'm not questioning that. The problem is that we need to have more engagement to provide information to citizens, to have citizens, involved in the process. So the role of think tanks, civic organization, NGOs is fundamental to provide information, but also there is a need to have, institutions to take more in serious consideration what citizens will say. I was hearing of Eli, but also Elisa saying, that most of the time those initiatives from citizens have somehow looked at from the European institution as something, that, okay, nice to have, but we can talk about something more important. This shouldn't happen, because already, the level of faith in the European institution is quite low, and in politics in general, and having instead citizens participating to these initiatives is fundamental to build trust in the European institutions. So it's important that the Commission and European Parliament started to, also, provide sign that, citizens are heard of. I wouldn't go as far as having, the European Parliament divided into citizens' assembly and representative and members of parliament, but still there are ways where citizens can be heard better. And one way is just for institutions and member of parliaments to talk about those initiatives and say, okay, citizens proposed something and we took into consideration. So in order to increase their voice across the EU. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleonora. So you mentioned information, right, and limited information about the very existence of these mechanisms among the citizens, right? I am also concerned about information and understanding of the issues. And I would like to ask you a question, about as an economist. You're the only economist in the room here. And economic issues are particularly difficult for people to understand. I mean, people often don't really understand how the economy works, right? And that's, I mean, we've seen that recently in the elections in the US. I mean, people could buy promises that made no sense, but because they just really don't understand how it works. So, as an economist, would you say it is possible to align EU economic governance with democratic principles, actually having citizens participate in major economic decisions? Are there any tools that are being used or could be used to make very complex EU policymaking accessible and engaging for citizens while maintaining, just reasonable debate?
Thank you. So another instrument that could be used is the public consultation from the Commission. So, the Commission has to open, those consultations to the public about, regulation or decision regarding the internal market or economic regulations. There is, a website, a portal whereby, everyone can access and, provide feedback or comments. The problem is that and these are data from the Good Lobby. 70–80% of those, comments or recommendations come from associations or private organizations. Why is that? Because most of the time, lobbying or private organization, they are the ones having more data and information. And it's not just they have more data or information, but they can write comments with, informative comments that are more easily picked up by politicians in the sense they are doing, the work that politicians should do. Of course, if I find the comments with, data and which very convincing arguments, it's easier for me as, a political representative to trust more those data than, something coming from citizens without data or references. This is one side. The other side is that arguments can be very technical and, citizens maybe don't have the tools, they don't have the times, they don't have the information to intervene on complex issues. So, one solution would be for the Commission to try to make the language as simple as possible, to explain things to citizens. There is a way, to explain everything, coming from university, that. And so trying to not simplify, but making the language more accessible to citizens. I think there is a chance to do that. And the third point is, as I said before, I'm sorry if I keep repeating this, but for me it's fundamental. Organization think tanks should play a role. For instance, my think tank, the Center for European Policy, we send, with our newsletter, information about public consultation from the Commission. And this is a way to share information to citizens, about, hey, you can, express your point of view about this consultation, about this regulation. And if you want more information, you can consult us and we'll provide you with our point of view. So this is a way, I think, of acting. We cannot always expect things to come from the top. I think if we want to have more participatory democracy, I think every citizen should be, its own boss, to say, okay, I want to do that, where I can find information, etc., etc. So, there is a level of responsibility from the institutions, but there is also a level of responsibility from citizens, I believe. Another, element that could be discussed is the participatory budgeting. So, a way whereby, citizens can be asked, to provide comments or information about public budget. This is an experiment that has been developed by the majority within the European, the majority has been implemented at local level, like municipalities level, because it's easier, of course, if you live in a small community or even in a city, most of the time you know what are the issues and you know where budget should be put on. This is much more complex at the European level because, we are talking about millions of citizens and different member countries with different economic performances and different needs. There has been a debate from the European Economic Social Committee last September. And this is about the multi-annual financial framework, which is the European budget document, basically, that is going to somehow estimate and provide money from different, fields in the years 2028, 2035. So this is the most important budget document from for the European Union. And again, the proposal from the European Economic Social Committee was that in order to allow citizens to have a say, we could have, a sort of online platform whereby citizens or local organizations or even regions could provide their point of view about the budget, on how, money should be invested and spent. And I believe this, again, is very important because, considering that for many citizens, being part of the European Union has been always related to the idea of being part, not just of a better democratic institution, but also, and let's face it, a functioning huge market that could provide, benefit to their life. So having those citizens again involved in the economic discussion about the future, I think would benefit not just the democracy, but also, the level of participation. And another interesting data is that functioning democracy provide GDP growth. There was a recent study from the Brookings Institute that said that when democracy are efficient and working, functionally, the raise in GDP can be calculated around 20–22%. So, this could also be a way for the European Union to recover from different, and multiple economic crises, which have been affecting citizens and mostly, low or medium income citizens. So, I think democracy and economic development are very much interrelated, and we cannot just keep or not consider, the problem we have in citizens' participation.
Thank you, Leonora. Well, that's a lot to think about. And I haven't forgotten about you, Elisa, and crowdsourcing. I mean, I'm really interested in, I'm intrigued actually to hear about your research on digital democracy and crowdsourcing. I mean, we know what it is, right? It's when you just sort of bring together lots of people bringing input to a task, a project, and when it's money, the input is money, we call it crowdfunding, right? But how does this work, like for democracy? I have no idea. So can you tell us a little bit about digital participation tools, how they can be integrated with traditional forms of democratic engagement? What are the risks? What safeguards are needed? Please.
All right, thank you. Yes, exactly. Crowdsourcing is often confused with crowdfunding, but it's another thing. It's really, collecting ideas based on the wisdom of the crowd. So it's just really a bunch of citizens working together with policymakers to come up with, legislative proposals or co-create policies together, etc. So ICAS, already 10 years ago, we founded the Digital Democracy Focus Area in our organization because we were studying these trends of using ICT in order to enhance governmental processes, decision-making, etc. And one thing that we really focus on is e-participation mechanism. So using ICT to connect citizens to decision makers and allow citizens to work on legislations together. And so we started also researching what kind of tools. So one was also, by Eleonora, was already mentioned, like participatory budgeting is very much used at the local level, very effective also in giving citizens some sort of empowerment in decision-making processes. There are also e-consultations, e-initiatives, like the Citizens Initiative that we run at the European level are quite used in Latvia, in Finland, etc. And then we started also studying crowdsourcing as a mechanism. And what we studied was really the case of Iceland, in which they were crowdsourcing their constitution right after the economic downfall, let's say. Around 2010, they started this whole process in which they asked the Icelandic citizens what they wanted to see in a revised constitution. So it's maybe the most important document of a country, right? The constitution. And how do you actually have citizens to come up with such an important document that can, state how their lives are in that country? It was a very, let's say, the process itself was very innovative and very interesting. There were flaws and challenges, of course, but it was groundbreaking in the sense that it really put into discussion like the possibilities of citizens actually co-creating pieces of legislation and even constitutions. We also analyzed another case in Finland in which citizens were asked to create an off-road traffic law together with politicians using crowdsourcing. And then, so we started trying to implement also this at the transnational level. And so a few years ago, we won a really big project of over 1 million, which was called the Code Europe project, in which we decided to, and we won a smaller project with the European Commission, and we implemented crowdsourcing as a mechanism on air quality in 10 different cities in Europe. So we asked in 10 different cities, basically, citizens to tell us what their problems are with air quality and what solutions do they want to see politicians bringing to the pollution of their air in their cities. It was a very interesting experiment. It lasted 1 year long, and we really got a lot of concrete, examples on how crowdsourcing could work. Now, just to go back to what we have been discussing, because it's a very, very long process. We have a lot of recommendations. If anyone is interested, we can also send out the link to our policy paper. But I think that the case for crowdsourcing at the EU level is that, first of all, I think that the participatory democracy toolbox, as we said, is very limited. So we have the Citizens Initiative, we have the consultations, etc. But we've seen that they're flawed. They're usually for stakeholders sometimes that because it's, a consultation process is way too technical, and also because it is already in the policy cycle. So when we see crowdsourcing at the EU level, we think that there should be a way for European citizens to have a better agenda setting tool. Because the truth is that I live in Brussels since already 15 years, 16 years. We work with the Commission, and there is a big disconnect amongst the EU institutions and the citizens, in the sense that many times the politicians that are creating the laws, they can rely on experts, but they don't have direct contact with what citizens feel in their daily life. And this is extremely important because we see how people vote many times based on emotions. If we don't predict those emotions, if we don't predict those daily problems, how can we be creating also the laws that can tackle their sentiments and their anger and their frustrations? So there should be a mechanism, and this can be crowdsourcing simply because a digital tool is more cost effective and, and more rapid as a technology to reach out to citizens and to ask them constantly to tell us what they think about specific topics. And then we imagine it in parallel to consultations that are usually for experts. So on the one hand, you could have crowdsourcing in order to have citizens set the agenda in the policy cycle. So really in the beginning, which is not too technical, and it's really to understand what they have at heart, and then have the consultation processes that are already in the policy cycle to help the Commission, start the legislation. And then we could have the citizen monitoring. So citizens are always part of the policy cycle, and the citizens evaluation also in the end of the whole process to see how, you know, the feedback mechanism was done, the impact was given, etc. So this is just one of the ideas that we have been really advocating for, also to pilot it more at the official EU level. But I think that our Code Europe project has showed that the transnational crowdsourcing is absolutely possible. And we had a bunch of recommendations also about the process itself, because that's also very important. But I do see that citizens could be really in a policy cycle at the agenda setting tool. That's where I really see citizens, because afterwards, I think we do need civil society experts, academics, to work together with policymakers before the final legislation is done. So, thanks.
Thank you, Elisa. So you already got us into the discussion of, well, new innovations. I know that's redundant, right? But we've been talking about other innovations that we've had for like 20 years. And now we are talking about potential, I mean, democratic innovations we could be considering. So I have a question for all of you. I think we can start with Daniela and then whoever else wants to come in. But I think, Daniela, I left you with a cliffhanger before. So it's a couple of questions. One is whether there are other potential democratic innovations worth considering. And also connected with this, whether there's a need for all these different participatory mechanisms to be coordinated in some way, to be combined in a way that creates a more coherent ecosystem of participation, rather than a collection of isolated tools. I mean, how they actually fit together. So yeah, there's these two separate questions. You could choose to answer one or the two of them.
Yeah, my answer is a little bit of a combination of the two, because with the second question, you a little bit answered how I would answer the first question, which is, I mean, it's not in full existence yet, but I mean, something that we promote and we support, if it's done right, is the combination of these two instruments that we have just talked about mostly over the last hour and a half, which is the European Citizens Initiative. So like such a petitioning instruments that you gather signatures, you have to mobilize, you have to reach 1 million signatures, and this European Citizens Panel, which is the deliberation exercise. The Citizens Assembly or Popular Assembly agreed it should be expanded to include EU residents. And so the combination of these two, because they kind of need each other. The European Citizens Initiative is a bottom-up instrument, right? But because of that reason, I mean, it really uses, the mobilization of citizens. For that reason, it lacks that political impact and that kind of political spark that it really needs at the end of that process. But it is bottom up. And so for that reason, we need to keep it, we need to strengthen it. Now, the other one, European Citizens Panels, has a little bit the opposite approach. It's a top-down at the moment, the way it's run. It's a top-down instrument. It's the European Commission, which decides on the topic, which decides how the European Citizens Panels are run, and on that entire process. And citizens are brought in only once the process is also set, of course, not like at the beginning of it, and when a topic is already decided. And because of that, it also lacks the visibility. It lacks really also the popularity. I mean, not to say that the European Citizens Initiative is the most popular instrument, but it is the second most popular instrument, because we've had already 20 million citizens who have signed a European Citizens Initiative. So it's the second most popular instrument after elections. But the European Citizens Panels definitely don't have that. I mean, definitely not in the level of recruitment, because the panels are 150 to 200 citizens big. But even if there would be this like digital platform that would help feed the process of the Citizens Assembly, we would still not reach those numbers. So a little bit, these two instruments could use each other. And one way that could happen without overcomplicating the two of them is that when you would have a successful European Citizens Initiative, meaning you meet the criteria. For us, success, we say you got 1 million signatures across 7 different member states. Then this would also, at the same time, trigger a European Citizens Panel, so a citizen assembly, a popular assembly on that topic. Because those who sign a European Citizens Initiative, you are signing for something. There's there's never been, at least, a counter ECI against the topic that has been running. So there's no vote to vote no onto something. And if the European Commission, we can also have this conversation. I think the European Parliament should deal with European Citizens Initiative also a lot more. But if the European Commission is also deciding now how to respond to European Citizens Initiative, they know that only those who signed yes. They didn't really hear, again, it's like the Citizens Assembly moment. We haven't really heard the full range of opinions on a topic, which gives a lot more legitimacy and push and grit behind an issue. So I would say there should be also Citizens Assembly, a popular assembly on that topic to get the wide range of views, hear the pros and cons, and then that gives a lot more political pressure on the Commission to act on it. I think the European Parliament should also have a much bigger role in all of this than it has. And then the other way that this could also work is the other way around. So not that a successful European Citizens Initiative triggers an assembly, but that a European Citizens Initiative could also collect signatures on starting a citizens assembly. So maybe the goal is also not just let's reach 1 million signatures. That's not the case for the wide majority of ECIs that get started, because it is difficult and it shouldn't be too easy, but it's also quite difficult. Some of them might say we want to use this instrument also as a launch pad for our topic, and we want to trigger a bigger European-wide debate, which happens once you reach 1 million signatures. But for those that don't reach that, I would say you can also have like a signature collection instrument, some citizens initiative right, to be able to select the topic of the next European citizens panels. So those are some of the ideas we've had on the combining of these instruments. That's what I would say we should also introduce, is finding more of the building up the ecosystem between all these floating instruments that we are discussing here, but that we haven't really found a way to connect them in a way that makes sense yet.
Thank you, Daniela. Anybody else wants to respond to any of these questions?
If I may, just this is just an idea, but considering that the participatory mechanism, as we were saying, works more efficiently at the local level. I'm talking about, for instance, the budgeting, or also the local level of assembly, because people knows what they're talking about. They are directly affected by the problems and they try to find local solution. One approach would be for the EU to basically to pick up a common problem. One of what I'm referring, for instance, is the housing problem. The housing problem is an effective problem which is affecting the majority of European citizens in different European member countries and at different levels, but it's a common problem. And the EU has not, the European institution, they have not, power over, the housing regulation, because it's a matter of national governments. But still, this is a European problem. One way could be, to use, local assembly or local solution or decision-making process, and for the EU to map, how, the problem is faced and resolved, or, somehow discussed at local level, and provide a recommendation across the EU to national governments to how to face the problem. This could allow citizens to be involved in the decision-making process, but also solution process of a problem which is affecting them and the majority of European member countries. And there's also a way to reverse the system. It's the European Union that is going to work for the citizens and not vice versa. So it's not citizens asking the EU to be listened, but the EU will be proactively listened to citizens and local administration in order to solve a problem which is affecting the European Union and its member countries.
Thank you, Leonora. Anybody else?
Yeah, if I may, I just wanted to add that apart from the crowdsourcing, I think that the fundamental problem is what also Eleonora was mentioning before, meaning the fact that citizens do not know, they're not aware about how they can participate, how they can have an impact. And I think that this is a crucial point, because it doesn't matter the innovation that we bring. If people are unaware of how they can actually contribute, then all of this is for nothing. And it's just, you know, a waste of time and a waste of energy. And especially if there is also no impact afterwards, like people will also get frustrated, and this will only backlash. I mean, people will start voting for more populist movements, candidates, because they feel like they're not being heard. So the thing that I always recommend is that we should have participatory democracy only if we're serious about it. That means that there is a strong political willingness to go through with whatever you're trying to ask citizens. That's why I was proposing the crowdsourcing, where it's the agenda setting, so that at least you meet the expectations of citizens instead of making grand promises and then not delivering, because that is actually the worst thing that you can actually do. And I also think that the problem of the unawareness of how the EU works and everything, for me, most of the blame is also on the member states themselves. Because of the fact that, you know, Brussels is such an easy scapegoat and everything for all the problems that happen, I also think that the communication of how the EU works and how you can participate is not being done by the member states and not being done at the national level and by the local level. Because honestly, and people live those daily lives at the local level. So if they don't know how the EU works, it's very improbable that they're actually going to want to participate, because it's also too much of an effort. It's just too much time that they consume to try to understand that something that they can't. And why would they be interested in actually doing it? So, I mean, I think that it's just a cycle of many different problems that are connected together that, I mean, all of the other speakers have also mentioned. But if we don't tackle also those issues in parallel, like participatory democracy is not a miracle solution to the problem of democratic deficit. That's mainly what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Elisa. Ophelia, I don't know if you want to come in with a...
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly react. Thank you. I mean, indeed, like I think that's a risk that you mentioned, Elisa, that is real and that we already see happening. The rise of populism goes hand in hand, unfortunately, sometimes with the rise of interest in participative democracy, which is quite worrying. And the two get connected because we can see a growing interest, for instance, from far-right elected politicians and just far-right in general, of using participative democracy instruments as a good example of how to put people at the center and how to have a more bottom-up approach and so on, and to be like, well, if you want to be heard, you the people, then we're going to put in place more participative democracy so that you feel that you can have a say in our system. So that's also an unexpected bias that we see rising of the growing interest in participative democracy tools. And I just wanted to react indeed to what was posted in the chat, because that's something that I think is quite important. Is we're trying to have more and more of an approach of translocal participation, meaning that we start from a local participation, which we then transform into the then transnational level. So starting from local realities where people would probably feel more comfortable and legitimate to engage, and then taking on that responsibility as civil society to being that bridge from this local reality onto institutions and transnational institutions such as the EU ones. And that's a process that, yeah, I think should be developed further. When we talk about participative democracy, we could think of how do we want to engage more with the Committee of the Regions, which doesn't have any legislative power at all, but still is an entity that is in touch with the population and with local authorities and regional authorities. So we could, I think, maybe, see how the Committee of the Regions could be a stronger support for civil society for this.
Thank you, Ophelia. So we're going to dedicate the final 15 minutes to responding questions from the audience. But before that, I have one last question. And I know, some of you, all of you, have actually emphasized how much better some of these democratic tools work at the local level, right? And how sometimes it's difficult to have them work at the regional, transnational level. And my question is exactly about that, because our interest in this, with these webinars, is actually to think about, UN reform and whether global governance institutions could be democratized by introducing some of these democratic innovations. So my question is, do you think any of these tools are potentially scalable to the global level, or yeah, we should basically give up? I think Daniela, yeah, I'm seeing you're dying to respond.
Yeah. I'm happy to take this up because, in fact, we talked a lot about the European Citizens Initiative now in this call, and in fact, we're running together with Civicus, the We the People's campaign, which is calling for basically a reform, a more democratization of the UN, and that's on 3 points. One is a UN civil society envoy, which you know very well. One is a UN parliamentary assembly, so having a democratic part to the UN, a directly elected body. And then the third one is the one that we are most active on, and that's a World Citizens Initiative. And this UN World Citizens Initiative would be just that. It would be really directed to the UN. So it's really based on the European Citizens Initiative. We ran a study. We had a legal expert of the ECI and a legal expert of the UN system, basically put their brains together and come forward with a proposal for how a UN World Citizens Initiative could look like in real life and practically in the system of the UN. And basically, I mean, first is we need something like this. I mean, we really need to democratize how the UN works. It's, unless you're Amal Clooney, you don't exactly get to take the stage of the UN and get to bring up your concerns that you have. Everything has to go through member states, but even through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Like it's even more difficult. It makes the EU look like much easier territory to manage. But we came up with this proposal. It's a campaign. I can share some links in the chat together with Civicus, which is based on the European Citizens Initiative. So again, it starts with a signature collection, and where you need a group of citizens to put forward the proposal to a UN body, which right now doesn't exist. I mean, with the ECI, it's clear it goes to the Commission, but we would suggest then that there would be a UN, like a World Citizens Initiative administrative board with members of the UN that would deal with that. That would deal with the registration of World Citizens Initiatives. And again, the same kind of process applies, just like with the European Citizens Initiative, where only those initiatives that are not against human rights, not against the UN values, so on, that are not going to put aside minorities. Like the idea is that it's supposed to be a really inclusive process. So there would be a check already from the beginning, just like with the ECI, before those initiatives can go forward. And then there's a signature collection process. Now, with maybe just go a little bit into the detail if you're interested, but I can share the links in the chat. With the ECI, we call for, the rule, it's 1 million signatures, right? That is required from 7 different member states. So that 1 million can't come from Germany alone. It has to be truly transnational and truly European. Same with the World Citizens Initiative. We call in this case for 5 million signatures. This is what our experts said that would be the most representative. Also looking at, the world population, and that it would come from 10 different member states. It would use the same kind of makeup that you have in the UN. I think it's 2 from African states, 2 from Asian states, 1 from Western Europe, and so the same kind of breakdown, but from 10 different regions, let's say 10 different member states, so that it again is truly transnational and really global in nature. And then the one thing that would really change, there's a couple of things, of course, that would change, but we base the World Citizens Initiative and the ECI. One biggest thing that would change would be, of course, where is this addressed to? Where does a successful, then you make, let's say you make 5 million signatures, you get it, you meet the threshold across all different member states. It's not all 5 million that come from China, for example. So the idea is that it would be addressed by either the Security Council or the General Assembly, depending on the topic. So some options could be, for example, that it could be added to the agenda of the general debate of the General Assembly, or it could also trigger a special session of the General Assembly, which we know they trigger also in special circumstances, or it can also, maybe even in the most ideal case, because that's where really the magic happens, is it's discussed in one of the 6 main UN committees. Now, again, like the European Citizens Initiative today, the instrument is today, what we're proposing with the World Citizens Initiative is not a binding instrument. That is really difficult. If not, I cannot think of a way to make that binding at global level unless you, I don't know, start introducing sanctions. But I think that overcomplicates, like, you know, what we're trying to do, and it doesn't actually achieve what we're trying to do with this. So it is, again, an agenda setting instrument, but it is a way that global citizens can then put forward their topic to the table of the UN, to global leaders, in a way that we just don't have that now. So if we talk about democratic deficit, we really have it at the UN level, but it's not impossible, because we've had this at the EU level, and then we brought in these kind of instruments, we introduced this, and we've closed that deficit significantly more. It's still not perfect, but we've significantly closed it from the early years of the EU. And so I think the UN has a lot that it can learn from the only other really transnational governing body that we can have, and we can look at the kind of democratic instruments we have at transnational level. So this is one of our proposals of how to scale up what is now the only transnational participatory instrument into a more global level.
Amazing. You have provided us the perfect entry point into the next session. So you are all welcome to come back in 2 hours after we're finished. In 2 hours time, we'll start another session about UN reform, and we'll be talking about these things, but we still have about 10 minutes for discussion. If any of you wants to mention anything else, to respond to anything, or if there are any questions from the audience, you know, you're all welcome to write your questions, or if you want to actually take the floor and ask a question, please. Now it's open for questions. Or Elisa, I think you want, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about what Daniela was mentioning around the scaling up the Citizens Initiative even more, like beyond the EU. And I thought it was, yeah, it is possible. I don't think that any of these participatory democracy mechanisms are impossible for scale up. I just think that the more you scale up, there are just more challenges, because of course, like, for example, with the European Citizens Initiative, there's the challenge of language, culture of participation, like, you know, which is not the same. And I guess that in the rest of the world, it would add a lot of complexity. But in general, I was also thinking, like, any other mechanism, I guess, would be useful at the UN level, because even if it's a consultation process, I guess that what it would be, according to me, the most interesting thing, because I think that one of the maybe the most controversial points of the UN is the veto. And it can be considered as maybe the most undemocratic process, right, of the UN, and it's very controversial. So maybe in my mind, like, something that would be very interesting would be to understand citizens' opinion about the veto system in the UN. So sometimes we only think about what we want maybe the European Union to talk about, or the UN to be talking about and discussing, but maybe sometimes it's interesting to use participatory democracy to build these institutions processes themselves, so to understand how the citizens would want to see the UN functioning. I don't know if I explain myself, but I think that it's not always about the policy topic, but it's also democratizing the processes themselves in which we have these institutions run, which is also very interesting, I think, for a citizen to have a say on them. And we've seen, like, the latest veto from the United States and everything. So this just made me think about how I would like to have a gigantic, citizens initiative or citizens consultation process in which we ask citizens, do you think the UN should continue giving veto to the permanent members of the UN? What do you think? And that would be super interesting. And then, yeah, up to the UN to decide if they want to make a change or anything. But I still think that it could put these discussions that are sometimes a bit taboo, maybe, but there for everyone to talk about. So
we have a question,
Yes.
I'm sorry, here in the chat from Hisham Adil. That says, how can we ensure that global governance systems are truly inclusive and represent the voices of marginalized communities?
So it's another question for anybody in particular. So
no,
if anybody wants to jump in, you're welcome. I don't see the chat for some reason. I don't know.
He sent to me only, and I couldn't copy to and paste to everyone.
Okay,
but
no problem.
Kashmir, you can do directly the question if you want.
Maybe can you repeat the question, and if anybody wants to answer, please just unmute yourself.
Well, just a quick answer from the participatory democracy side of things at the European Union. Like, the reason why we also think that it's important that there are multiple channels of participatory democracy tools is because we want to reach out to as many people possible. So I'm going to give a very concrete example. Like here in Brussels, for example, I was invited through a letter by the Brussels Commune to take part in the Citizens' Assembly. It would have taken me 4 weekends of my time to be part of the Citizens' Assembly. I have 2 kids. For me, it was absolutely impossible to actually be part of this democratic movement. But this doesn't mean that I'm not interested. It's just simply that tool itself didn't meet my needs. And you can imagine people who are, both full-time workers, the only moment that they can actually spend time as a family is on weekends. They are not going to go and waste, according to them, waste their time to also be in a room to discuss about politics with other people. So the reason why we also propose alternatives, for example, crowdsourcing, is because we can imagine that even if I am a working parent and at night I have a bit of time, I could go on the crowdsourcing platform and basically say, okay, this is my input. I don't have any more time than 5 minutes, but I do think that filling out this whatever consultation process or signing this petition is important. I'll just quickly do it. And that's how I give some sort of impact. So if we want to really reach out, we always need to think about complementary tools. And maybe this was also one of the questions, Ines, that you wanted to pose, like, how can these things all fit together? So we have elections, we have multiple channels, we have online, we have offline. We also always say that online cannot go without offline. And online also needs to be accessible. So we need to do auditing, and sometimes we work with the European Disability Forum to make sure that whatever participatory democracy mechanism is online, there is a possibility offline. And then when we do campaigns, we cannot think about just reaching out to, the typical, the white male that is more prone to going on the internet to give. No, you need to think about the women, you need to think about migrants, you need to think about people with disabilities. And actually at ICAS, we work a lot also around a digital transformation that leaves no one behind, because if not, you will lose these voices. And also Daniela mentioned the not pure sortition method, which is also very interesting, because if you're talking about something that affects one part of the population, then you cannot think that it's only, we take the whole population and then we make a sortition out of no, you're trying to target. So you need to think more strategically in terms of what you're trying to achieve with participatory democracy. And if you have this holistic approach, then you will find strategies to reach out to also marginalized communities and, people with disabilities, etc.
Wonderful. Do we have any other questions? Reactions? No? You left us all thinking, so we are just quickly thinking, but yeah, no questions. Let's wait a couple minutes. Let's see if anybody else wants to ask something or comment something, or otherwise I will give you, the four of you, the last word. Anything you want to say to leave us thinking a little bit more, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to go with the last word. I think just when we talk about participative democracy instruments, we have to be careful that we ensure that they serve the purpose of what we want to achieve first, which is like recreating a form of trust and of engagement between the population and their institutions. I'm not an anarchist, so I don't think we should tear down the capital. But I do think that we have to think of a reform of our institutions, especially EU institutions. So treaty change is definitely an ultimate goal. But in the meantime, doesn't mean that we just have to wait for treaty change to happen. And we can think of reforms or add-ons that do not require those treaty change just yet. And that in doing that, we make sure that we're going into rebuilding that trust and giving an actual space to citizens, and that it's not just a mock space or a pretend space. And that it's not something that would be just used as a form of communication tool by the institutions, but that it's really a tool that can improve that participation in a genuine way. And that will be it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa, Eleonora, Daniela.
Yeah, I can jump in and say one last. I know we're just in the last minute, but I think like the common theme that we all really spoke about was impact. Ophelia also mentioned now really the genuine approach and outreach to citizens. We need to really make sure that at the end it's a genuine approach, but and also that this has political impact at the end. Otherwise, citizens will just get frustrated, and we can introduce a million different tools, but if they don't really lead to something, then citizens will look for maybe other alternatives, who are the loud voices in our political spheres, who are scapegoating minorities and so on, and looking to them for political answers. And so we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot. When we do this, we need to make sure that it actually leads to trackable political impact, and that is communicated also in a way that is approachable to citizens. Sometimes we see these political communications and you think you need a PhD to be able to understand what has been published here. And so I think that these kind of communications could be also done in a much more user-friendly and also approachable way. So first we need to deliver those results, or at least decision makers need to deliver those results, and then they need to be made clear to people. What is it? We have helped made your water quality better. Perfect. We have made housing more affordable. Perfect. But that needs to be communicated in ways that people actually understand on the issues they care about.
I agree with you, Danielle. I think communication is, and simplification of key arguments, I think it's key. And coming back to participatory democracy, I think is not, as I said before, it's not nice to have. I think it's something that the EU needs to have, not just because it's written in the treaties, but also because it allows democracy to be more effective. And more effective democracy means also better economic system and more welfare, and generally, more happier citizens. And as I said before, angry citizens do not vote, most of the time vote for radical parties. And this is, a sort of circle that, repeats itself. We saw what happened in history in Europe when, radical party went to the power. So, we should avoid that for the future.
And I guess that I would just want to continue on the communication, the importance of communication. And I would just want to end by saying that I think when we talk about politicians and how they communicate, it must come from a sense of honesty as well. I think that the reason why people vote for very right-wing and populist actors, let's say, is because that they feel like it reflects what they're feeling, right? Their emotions. And sometimes I feel like politicians overcomplicate things and want to pretend that, times are, you know, difficult and everything, but they don't have this way of communicating from a point of just complete honesty. I think that sometimes people just want to hear that, yeah, situations and the world is just very complex and we don't always have the answers. And they want to simply hear that politicians are sincere in this, and we need to meet citizens' expectations also in participatory democracy. We need to just tell them that obviously whatever comes from them, there cannot be immediately an impact on legislation. But we need to really meet those expectations. We cannot make constantly big promises and not meet those big promises. I would prefer a politician that would say, look, I don't have the answers. We're figuring things out with academics, experts, civil society, and we want to also consult you on how we can, you know, deal with the situation of inflation. What are your problems in your daily life? How can we solve your air pollution in your city together with you? But this, I don't feel like this is coming from the politicians, like, you know, that are always fighting against the far right and the populistic movements. So this is something that the communication is so important, and we cannot keep citizens from a distance, because if not, we'll never manage to understand their frustrations and try to, you know, mitigate all of the upcoming risks, unfortunately, we'll have at the global scene too.
Well, thank you for the great recommendations. And I just want to close by thanking you all, the four of you, for dedicating your time and sharing your knowledge and insights with all of us. We are really lucky to have had the opportunity to learn so much from all of you. So thank you very much. And thanks to all of you who attended this webinar. See you in a couple hours. I hope you will see you all again to discuss the UN in a couple of hours.
Thanks again to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.